Man, I've seen some crazy things on the road, you know. I've been driving these trucks for over 2 decades, coast to coast and border to border. You see things out here that most people won't believe. But this still gives me shivers. I believe it was back in 2018. Yeah, 18. I've got a load from Portland, Oregon to Albuquerque, New Mexico. Nothing extraordinary, just your average dry items. It was late summer, and the air was dense with humid heat that sat on you like a wet blanket. I stopped for the night at a truck stop outside Boise, Idaho. You know the type, greasy spoon restaurant attached, flickering neon signs swarming with exhausted moths. I filled up Big Bess, as I refer to my rig, then got a burger and a black coffee. That's when I first saw it. This old beat-up automobile was parked across the lot, hiding away in the shadows. I don't recall the brand or model. I've never been a vehicle enthusiast, but it was the color that captivated me. This sickly, fading yellow resembles ancient teeth. And it was dusty, sir, like if it had been sitting there for days. I didn't think much of it at the moment. Truck stops attract a diverse range of people. I assumed it was simply some guy down on his luck. I finished my coffee, hopped back into Big Bess, and began the road again. Now, I'm not one for rushing a haul. I take my time, appreciate the view, and listen to some excellent country music. But as the kilometers passed, I began seeing that yellow automobile again. At first, I assumed it was a coincidence. You know, same roadway, same direction, destined to meet paths. But it kept occurring. That nasty yellow automobile was always there when I stopped for gas or took a break, always lurking in the shadows, whether a few spots down or across the lot. It began getting to me, you know. I found myself checking my mirrors more often, monitoring the road behind me. My instinct told me something was wrong. One night, I stopped into a rest station in Wyoming. It was late, perhaps 2 a.m., and the location was desolate. Only me, Big Bess, and the wind screaming through the woods. I decided to take a sleep and attempt to shake off the bad sensation. I awoke with a start, my heart racing in my chest. The interior of the taxi was chilly, and a heavy fog had swept in, leaving everything in eerie quiet. I wiped my eyes, attempting to get the sleep out of my mind, and that's when I noticed it. The yellow automobile. It was parked right next to Big Bess, so near I could almost reach out and touch it. The fog was so dense that I couldn't see who was inside, but I could sense eyes watching me. I'm not sure what came over me, but I snapped. I grabbed my tire iron, which I keep beneath my seat for emergencies, and slammed open the cab door. "All right, that's it," I screamed through the gloom. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but leave me the hell alone." Silence. The fog seemed to draw in closer, choking me. I took a step nearer the automobile and raised the tire iron. The fog then dissipated almost as fast as it had formed. The yellow automobile was gone, vanished without a trace. I stood there for a long time, heart beating, clutching the tire iron in my hand. The sun began to rise, coloring the sky in shades of orange and pink. I felt dumb, afraid, and more alone than I had ever been in my life. I never saw the yellow automobile again, but even now I can't escape the sensation that I was being watched, followed, and stalked. And every time I see a beat-up old car, particularly one painted that sickly, faded yellow, I get a shudder down my spine. Because out here on the open road, in the great nothingness of this country, you never know what's waiting in the darkness. Story 2. Let me tell you, after years of moving freight, you get used to the stillness. The engine hum and the wind blowing past your rig serve as your music out here in the middle of nowhere. But this was different. This was the type of silence that crawls under your skin and causes the hairs on the back of your neck to stand on end. A few years ago, I was on a run from El Paso, Texas to Denver. A long length of roadway, primarily desert, with nothing to look at beyond the odd tumbleweed and the infinite horizon. I was pressing through the night, attempting to make up time, when I saw a sign advertising Dusty's Diner. I'd never heard of Dusty's before, despite having traveled almost every back road this side of the Mississippi. But my stomach was grumbling, and the coffee in my thermos had gone cold hours before. I figured it was worth a try. Pulling up to the restaurant was like going back in time. One of those old-school establishments, chrome and neon, seems to have been unchanged since the 1950s. A few more trucks were parked out front, with their drivers nestled inside, basking in the warm light of the windows. I killed the engine, and then it struck me. The quiet. Not a single sound. There are no crickets singing, no wind howling, and not even the distant rumbling of another vehicle on the highway. The world seemed to have gone silent. As I stepped out of my rig, the air seemed thick, charged as before a thunderstorm. My phone buzzed in my pocket, so I took it out, anticipating a call from dispatch. But the screen was black, dead. I tried turning it on and off many times, but nothing happened. Then I observed the other drivers, who were crowded inside the restaurant, were beginning to emerge. Faces paled, eyes wide with an unfamiliar expression of uncertainty and terror. "What the hell is going on?" one of them said, his voice barely audible. "Don't know," another said, his eyes darting about uncomfortably. "My phone's dead, radio's out, everything's fried." We examined all of our gadgets, but the results were the same. Phones, CB radios, and vehicle engines are all dead, as if someone had turned off the electricity to the whole building. And then we noticed them in the darkness beyond the diner's lights. Figures. Tall, lean, and almost skeletal, their bodies were concealed behind long, flowing robes. They proceeded slowly and methodically, as if they were wading through deep water. There are no faces, just shadows, where the heads should be. A chilly fear grabbed my heart. I'd never believed in ghosts or monsters. I assumed they were merely tales people made to terrify one another. But standing there, seeing those monsters emerge from the darkness, I realized something was very wrong. "We gotta get out of here," one of the drivers remarked, his voice trembling with fear. He ran for his vehicle, but one of the creatures rushed with inhuman speed, stopping him before he could reach the cab. We could hear him scream, a high-pitched, frantic cry that was swiftly drowned out by the stifling quiet. The remainder of us dispersed, dashing wildly in all directions. I could hear the other vehicles behind me. Their footfall were heavy and anxious. However, the statistics were quicker. I seen one of them reach out, its long, bony fingers wrapping around the ankle of the motorist next to me. He cried and disappeared into the darkness. I did not glance back. I simply continued running, my lungs hurting and my legs begging me to stop. But I was unable to stop, not when those creatures were still around. I'm not sure how long I ran, but I finally stumbled out of the darkness into the highway. The first rays of morning were just beginning to appear over the horizon, creating a faint light on the desolate road. My vehicle had vanished, along with the other trucks and the cafe itself. It seemed as if the whole building had gone into thin air. I eventually flagged down a passing trucker a few hours later. He drove me to the closest town, where I notified the authorities. They didn't trust my tale, of course. They thought I was insane, saying I had probably fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the entire affair. But I remember what I saw that night, and I know that somewhere out there, in the great expanse of this nation, the laws of reality bend and the darkness contains something genuinely awful. Story 3. They claim you get connected to your rig after a time. Spend enough hours behind the wheel and nights sleeping in that cabin, and it will become your home on the road. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened to Big Blue. I had been running routes for nearly 5 years before I acquired him. a 1978 Peterbilt 359, a vintage beauty. Big Blue, he was a fixer-upper when I bought him, but I put my heart and soul into that truck. We rebuilt the engine, cleaned the chrome, and even gave him that unique blue paint job that turned heads wherever we went. And Big Blue always appeared to reciprocate the favor. He was dependable, tough as nails, and never caused me any difficulty. He and I worked together to transport goods throughout this vast country. However, there were some things. At start, everything seemed little. When I turned on the engine, it would purr almost like a cat, or how the headlights appeared to follow me around at night. Naturally, I shrugged it off. I assumed it was simply my imagination, becoming too connected to a piece of metal and rubber. Then the dreams arrived. Vivid, passionate visions of flying through the stars and planets drenched in bizarre alien light. Big Blue is at the core of it all. But that wasn't the vehicle I knew. This was not like before, sleek and strong, with shimmering blue lines throughout its body. It might change, alter, or become something completely different. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, with my dreams sticking to me like cobwebs. I began to notice things when driving as well. Shadows shifted in the corner of my eye, and odd lights flickered in the distance. I thought I saw Big Blue's reflection in a gas station window, but it seemed twisted and foreign. I knew I was losing it. The hard hours and seclusion were starting to take their toll. I told myself I needed a break, time away from the road. But then the night arrived, and everything changed. I was traveling from Chicago to Los Angeles, across the Arizona desert, with a cargo of gadgets. It was a moonless night, with stars twinkling above like jewels on black velvet. I recall feeling anxious and on edge. It seemed as if something was watching me. The CB radio suddenly sprang to life. A strong and booming voice burst from the speakers. "Michael," it said, and the hairs on the back of my neck rose up. "We need your help." I hesitated, my fingers hanging above the send button. Who's this?" I stuttered, my voice barely above a whisper. "It is me, old friend," the voice said. "Do not be terrified. We're in danger." And that's when Big Blue's engine fired up. I heard a loud, guttural growl that rocked the earth under us, rather than the normal rumbling. The headlights blazed, illuminating the desert in a strange blue glow. My blood chilled as I glanced out the windshield. Standing in the center of the road, towering above Big Blue, there was something. It had a somewhat humanoid form, but its body was all sharp angles and luminous lines, like something from a science fiction film. The eyes were piercing blue and riveted on me. "Michael," said the voice again, this time coming from the beast. "It is time." Then, in before of my eyes, Big Blue started to morph. Metal twisted and contorted, gears whirred and grind, and the familiar form of my vehicle vanished like wax beneath the flame. I sat there, immobilized by terror and astonishment, while Big Blue became something else. Something strong, grand, or terrible. The remainder is a bit of a haze. I recall bursts of light, the earth trembling under us, and the howl of something unnatural ripping through the night. When I regained consciousness, the sun was rising, coloring the desert sky orange and pink. Big Blue was parked near me, gazing about as if he were his old self. But I already knew the truth. I'd seen what was behind the surface, the secret he kept. I never mentioned that night to anybody. Who'd trust me? But I knew deep down that I wasn't simply a truck driver anymore. I was something different, something related to the stars and the grandeur of the cosmos. Big Blue wasn't simply a vehicle. He was my companion, my defender, and the doorway to a world beyond our knowledge. Story 3. I've always been a sound sleeper. Put me in the cab of my truck, the engine humming, and I'm out like a light. But that night, sleep tricked me. A nasty and difficult prank. I was moving timber from Eugene, Oregon to Sacramento. The trip was long, but I wasn't in a rush. We stopped for the night at a rest spot just outside of Medford. A quiet location, with trees whispering in the breeze and the scent of moist dirt in the air. I ate my meal in the taxi, listened to Johnny Cash on the radio, and dozed asleep. I don't recall any dreams from that night. There are no dreams, no sirens, nothing. Just blank. Like someone pressed the fast-forward button on my slumber. I awoke to sunshine flowing through the glass, and birds chattering as if they were at a conference outside. I stretched, yawned, and felt a familiar aching in my lower back. I reached for my thermos and took a sip of lukewarm coffee. All is normal. However, something felt odd. The air smelled strange, sharper and cleaner. The trees outside weren't pines. These were higher, thicker, and the leaves were a tint of green I had never seen before. I examined my dashboard clock. 8:30 a.m. I thought I'd only slept for a few hours, but the sun was already high in the sky. Where was the familiar buzz of the engine? Big Red, my Kenworth, was usually idle when I slept. When I got out of the vehicle, my blood went cold. I was in the wilderness. A deep, primordial forest, with sunlight barely seeping through the canopy above. There is no trace of a rest facility, roadway, or other cars. The trees stretched as far as the eye could see. And Big Red was gone. Panic rushed through me, cold and stinging. I swung around, looking for any landmark or indication of civilization. Nothing. Just endless, quiet. Trees. I shouted out, my voice faint and reedy in the silence. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" Only the echo responded to me. I'm not sure how long I traveled through the woodland. Hours, maybe days. Time seemed to lose its meaning. The sun rose and set, yet something seemed odd. It seemed like it was going too quickly, or that I was moving too slowly. I discovered a clear, cool brook and drank deeply. I tried to organize my thoughts and make sense of what had transpired. Had I drove off the road while asleep? Have you lost consciousness and gone out into the wilderness? It looked preposterous, but was there any other explanation? Then, as the sun started to set on the second day, I saw it. A light, flickering through the woods in the background. Hope raced through me, powerful enough to overcome my anxiety and tiredness. I lurched toward the light, my legs screaming in protest. As I approached, I could hear voices, human voices, and the scent of wood smoke is tantalizingly familiar. I rushed through the woods into a clearing. In the midst of the clearing, there stood a settlement. Small, maybe a dozen cottages built of wood and mud, smoke rising slowly from their thatched roofs. People wearing rust-spun garments stopped and gazed at me as I came from the jungle. Their cheeks were worn, and their eyes were full of inquiry and distrust. I attempted to talk, to explain who I was and how I got there, but the words would not come. My throat was too dry, and my thoughts were too confused. An elderly lady moved forward, her face lined with wrinkles. She talked to me in a language I didn't understand, but her voice was pleasant and comforting. She gave me water and snacks, which I happily accepted. I spent the following several days in that community, attempting to put together what had occurred. The people, although suspicious at first, were kind to me. They spoke a dialect of English that I couldn't quite grasp, but it was enough to converse. They informed me that I was in a remote area of the Appalachian Mountains, miles from any major highways or cities. They'd never seen a vehicle like mine before, and they couldn't figure out how I'd gotten there. I knew they thought I was insane. Perhaps I was. But I felt deep down that something unthinkable had occurred to me. Something that defied logic and reasoning. I never discovered Big Red. The locals assisted me in contacting the authorities, and I was able to return to my familiar environment after a few weeks. But a little fearful part of me remained stranded in that woodland, stuck on the wrong side of slumber. Story 4. Throughout my years on the road, I've transported almost anything. Produce, gadgets, and even cattle. You become acclimated to the noises of a full trailer, creaks and moans, shifting weight. But nothing prepared me for the sound of screaming. It was a hot summer night, and I was running from Phoenix to Dallas. I picked up my cargo in a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Standard refrigerated trailer, secured tightly, with papers indicating it contained medical goods. I didn't think much of it. It was just another job. The first couple of hours were unremarkable. The desert spread out on both sides of the roadway, limitless and harsh. Even with the windows rolled down, the air seemed thick and still. I kept the radio on low, listening to Merle Haggard sing about heartache and roads while trying to avoid the terrible heat. That's when I overheard it. A tiny scraping sound emanates from the trailer. I assumed it was simply some loose equipment rattling about, but the sound continued, becoming louder and more relentless. Then came the thumping, deep, resonant thuds, as if something heavy was hurled against the trailer's walls. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart beating against my chest. I checked my mirrors, but there was nothing behind me but the deserted highway, bathed in the eerie glow of my taillights. I grabbed my flashlight and exited the taxi, the scorching tarmac searing through the bottoms of my boots. The clawing and hammering became much louder, frenzied and desperate, and suddenly, amid all the commotion, I heard it. A scream, high-pitched, full of sorrow and horror. It sent shivers down my spine. I knew I should call for aid and contact dispatch, but something stopped me. A sick interest, maybe. Or maybe it's simply basic fear. I took a deep breath and moved gently towards the rear of the trailer. The air seemed to spark with odd electricity, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on edge. I lifted my flashlight, my hand quivering, and pointed it at the trailer doors. The shrieking reached a fever pitch, and the hammering became more intense, the metal groaning beneath the pressure. I paused for a second, before taking a big breath and throwing open the doors. The stink struck me first. A flood of rotten flesh and foul air was so powerful that I almost fell to my knees. I gagged and waved my palm in front of my face, attempting to clear the air. I saw them when my eyes adjusted to the faint light coming in through the open doors. Bodies. There must be dozens, if not more. Pale and malnourished, their eyes were wide with fear. They were jammed against the trailer's far wall, hands out and mouths wide in mute screaming. However, they were not dead. Not precisely. Their chests rose and fell with short, ragged breaths, and their gaze followed my every movement. I staggered back, my thoughts whirling. What the heck had I gotten into? These were not medicinal supplies. These were persons. But they were different. Their skin was clammy and almost transparent, and their eyes shone with an unearthly brightness. One of them, a young lady with matted hair and ragged clothing, sprang at me, her hand extended and her fingers curled like claws. I slammed the doors shut, just as her frustrated cry echoed throughout the trailer. I remained there for a long time, my pulse racing in my chest and the stink of rot filling my nostrils. I knew I needed to do something, but what? Call the cops? They wouldn't believe me. What about calling dispatch? They'd think I'm nuts. Finally, I did the only thing I could think of. I went back into my truck, shut the doors, and drove. I drove into the night, the cargo's moans reverberating in my ears, and the stink of rot clinging to my clothing. I ultimately left the trailer at a truck stop many states away. I never told anybody what I saw that night. Who will believe me? But occasionally, Late at night, when the wind is howling and the shadows are deep, I can hear the screaming, a sobering reminder that certain things are better left alone, buried away in the dark. Story 5. I've always been a CB radio operator. Sure, everyone has sophisticated cell phones and satellite radios these days, but there's something about the crackling of static, the faint voices cutting through the airwaves that ties you to the road, to the other cars out there in the dark. But this was different. It was a frigid December night, and I was carrying Christmas decorations from Denver to Salt Lake City. Snow was falling heavily, creating a thick blanket of white on the roads, making the travel sluggish and perilous. I had the CB on, largely listening to other truckers' conversation about road conditions and weather updates. Then the static struck, a sudden explosion of white noise, so powerful that I jumped in my seat. I grabbed for the volume knob, but before I could lower it, a voice broke through the static. A woman's voice, soft, melodious, with a trace of melancholy, perhaps. It was difficult to tell through the interference. "Can anyone hear me?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, I need help." I paused, my fingers hanging above the send button. I'd heard reports of weird broadcasts and inexplicable voices over the CB, but I discounted them as pranks or hallucinations. But this felt different, real. "Hello?" I replied, my voice uncertain. "Who's this?" The static became louder for a bit, before the woman's voice returned, stronger this time. "My name is Sarah," she answered. "Please, you must trust me. I'm trapped." "Trapped?" I replied, my brow furrowed. "Trapped where?" "I don't know," she responded, her voice full of worry. "It's chilly and dark. I cannot see anything. There are things here. Please assist me." I wasn't sure what to say. Part of me wanted to write it off as a hoax, a terrible joke. However, there was something in her voice, the desperation in her tone, that sounded real. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "I don't know," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm not sure how I got here. It's like another universe. If you can hear me, please don't hang up." I paused for a second, my thoughts whirling. Was I actually speaking to someone stuck in another dimension? It felt impossible and ridiculous, but I couldn't escape the idea that this was genuine and that this lady, Sarah, was counting on me. "I'm here," I said, my voice steady. "I'm listening." We chatted for what seemed like hours, yet it may only have been a few minutes. Sarah identified herself as a university student from an unknown location. She was working late at the library when the lights dimmed, and now she's here, wherever here was. She described a location of eternal darkness, a barren landscape enveloped in mist. She said there were things present. She didn't say much, but the dread in her voice said volumes. I attempted to keep her talking to gain additional information, but the static became worse. Her voice went in and out, and her words were lost in the cacophony. "Sarah?" I replied, my heart pumping. "Sarah, can you hear me?" The static crackled and hissed, and her voice emerged one more time, weak and garbled. "Please, don't forget MME." Then quiet. Outside my taxi, all I could hear was static hissing and the wind's dismal scream. I stayed there for a long time, my fingers still lingering over the broadcast button and listening to the quiet airways. I attempted to rouse Sarah again, but there was no response, just unending, uninteresting static. I never heard from Sarah again. A part of me wanted to think it was all a dream, a delusion caused by the long hours and solitude of the road. But deep down, I remember what I heard that night. A voice from someplace else, pleading for aid that I couldn't respond. And occasionally, late at night, when the static crackles on the CB, I can almost hear her voice again, speaking through the silence, a frightening reminder that certain roads lead to places we were never intended to travel. Story 6. I am a sucker for ancient maps, always has been. Something about the fading lines, the hand-drawn details, and the names of long-gone locations really piques my interest. So, when I saw the antique maps stashed away in a dusty corner of a gas station along Route 66, I couldn't resist. The petrol station itself was an antique, a fading beauty from another age. The type of shop that time forgot, with a bell that rung when you stepped in and a grizzled old guy behind the counter who seemed to have seen it all. I was looking through the normal selection of beef jerky and tire gauges when I saw it. A rolled-up piece of parchment, wrapped with a fading crimson ribbon, was concealed under a postcard rack. The paper was yellowed with age, fragile to the touch, and the writing had faded, but I could still see the contour of a map. "What's this?" I questioned the elderly guy, holding out the map. He looked at it through thick spectacles. "Don't rightly know," he answered, his voice hoarse with age. "I found it when cleaning up the rear room a while ago. I figured it was simply rubbish." "Mind if I take a look?" I asked. He shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said, returning to his newspaper. I unrolled the map on the counter, taking care not to break the delicate paper. It portrayed a piece of the Arizona desert, but it was unlike any other map I had ever seen. The roads were different, and the landmarks were foreign. In the middle, marked in fading red ink, was a town. The name of the town sent shivers down my spine. Silent Hollow. I had been carrying freight across Arizona for years, and knew the highways like the back of my hand, but I had never heard of Silent Hollow. The way it was designed and how the adjacent highways appeared to avoid it bothered me. "Ever heard of this place?" I questioned the elderly guy, pointing to the circular town. He looked up from his newspaper again, his eyes narrowing. "Can't say I have," he responded quietly. "I would avoid that if I were you. Some regions are better left alone." He returned to his newspaper and dismissed me with a sweep of his hand. I paused for a second, a curious combination of intrigue and anxiety surging through my belly. But the allure of the unknown, the prospect of discovering a location lost to time, was too powerful to refuse. I purchased the map and a cup of coffee that tasted suspiciously like it had been made that morning, then started the road. I followed the map's fading lines, since my GPS was worthless in this forsaken area of the desert. As I moved farther from the highway, the roads became rougher and the terrain more bleak. The sun beat down on my rig, and the air was heavy with the scent of dust and sagebrush. And then, just as I was ready to give up, I saw it. An old and shattered sign, yet still legible, Silent Hollow 5 miles. My heart hammered in my chest as I drove the last few kilometers. The road shrunk to nothing more than a dirt track, traveling through a bleak environment of scrub bush and towering rock formations. The sun was sinking, creating long shadows over the desert, and there was complete calm, broken only by the roar of my motor. And there it was, Silent Hollow. It felt like walking back in time. A little village hidden in a valley surrounded by high cliffs, its houses made of wood and adobe, with faded and peeling paint. A single dirt road wound through the heart of town, past deserted businesses and boarded-up residences. The quiet hit me the most. There is no sound of automobiles, conversations, dogs barking, or wind chimes. There's only quiet, a thick, suffocating quiet that appeared to bear down on me like a bodily burden. I parked my trailer on the outskirts of town, my stomach churning with worry. I should have gone back, I knew, but something urged me to remain, to discover what mysteries this abandoned area had. As I got out of my truck, the quiet enveloped me, emphasizing every squeak of my leather boots on the dusty ground. The air was silent and thick, with a slight metallic flavor that I could not identify. I went along the quiet street, my palm resting on the handle of my pocket knife, my senses heightened. The buildings were all tightly shut up, with dark and vacant windows. There are no traces of life anywhere. I arrived to the heart of town, a little square with a dried-up fountain in the middle. And that's when I saw them, the shadows. They moved around the edges of my vision, darting between buildings and lurking in doorways. Too quickly to get a distinct picture, but it's obviously there. They are watching me. I turned around, my pulse thumping, but there was nothing there. Just an empty street, motionless buildings, and stifling stillness. I ran. I hurried back to my rig, my boots kicking up dust, and the shadows seemed to follow me, always just out of reach. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove out of Silent Hollow without looking back. I never went back. I never told anybody what I saw that night. But occasionally in my nightmares, I can hear the quiet, a deafening, soul-crushing quiet that speaks of forgotten things, of secrets better kept hidden. Story 7. I've always been skeptical. What about Bigfoot, Mothman, the Jersey Devil, and other cryptids? People tell each other scary tales over a campfire. Or so I thought. See, I have a dash cam in my truck. Safety comes first, you know? Plus, it came in useful a few times to prove I wasn't at blame in those fender benders. But what it captured that night in the Adirondacks made me reconsider my reservations. It was late October. The leaves were turning gorgeous hues of crimson and gold, and the air was crisp with the scent of pine and wood smoke. I was transporting maple syrup from Vermont to New York City via the picturesque route via the Adirondack Mountains. The sun had already set, leaving long shadows among the woods, and a light fog was drifting in, clinging to the valleys like wisps of smoke. I was riding along a 2-lane highway, the only sound being the hum of my motor and the odd hoot of an owl, when something grabbed my attention in the headlights. A figure, tall, at least 8 feet tall, with black fur, loping over the road front of me. It moved with incredible speed and agility for a vehicle of size, vanishing into the woods on the opposite side of the highway before I could even use the brakes. I slammed the brakes nevertheless, my heart thumping in my chest and my mind trying to grasp what I had just seen. It couldn't have been a bear. It wasn't that huge and didn't move like that. And that was certainly not human. I pulled over to the side of the road, hands trembling, and groped for my dash cam. It had to have gotten it, whatever it was. The camera was installed on my windshield, capturing everything. I struggled with the controls, rewinding the tape, my pulse racing with terror and excitement. So there it was. The thing was as visible as day, loping across the road in front of my pickup. There was just a few seconds of film, but it was plenty. Enough to send shivers down my spine and for the hair on the back of my neck to stand on edge. I viewed the tape many times, each time becoming more persuaded that I'd recorded something absolutely exceptional. This was not a scam, nor was anybody dressed in a costume. This was genuine. I needed to show someone, tell someone. This was unequivocal evidence that the things that go bump in the night are more than simply tales. I grabbed for the memory card, ready to download the film and share it with the world. However, as I closed my fingers around the card slot, it was vacant. The memory card was gone. I tore apart the cab of my vehicle, seeking everywhere I could think of, but it was in vain. The memory card, the sole record of what I had seen that night, was disappeared. I proceeded on my journey to New York City, my thoughts racing and my stomach churning with a combination of amazement and anxiety. Had someone taken the card? Or had something else? Something that did not wish to be noticed or have its presence known. I never discovered the missing footage, and a part of me is happy, because certain things should remain unknown, shrouded in the darkness. But every time I go through the Adirondacks, particularly at night, when the fog comes in and the shadows deepen. I can't help but wonder what else is out there, watching from the woods just beyond my headlights range. Story. I've always been a tattoo guy. When I was 18, I got my first one, a skull and crossbones on my bicep, representing freedom and living life on my own terms. Over time, I added more, each conveying a tale and commemorating a point in time. But the final one, which I purchased on a whim in a dusty, tiny boutique in New Orleans, altered everything. It was a snake wrapped around a knife, teeth bared in a wordless growl. The tattoo artist, a wiry old lady with eyes that seemed to look straight through me, had warned me about it. They said it was a significant symbol that should not be taken lightly. But I was young and inexperienced, and I loved how it looked on my arm. For years, the tattoo was just a work of art engraved into my flesh. But then, slowly and softly, things began to alter. It started with the dreams. I experienced vivid, scary nightmares of shadows and whispers, chilly scales and deadly teeth. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the image of the snake tattoo etched in my head, its eyes appearing to follow and watch me. Then came the desires, the sudden want to lash out, to harm, to demolish. It was like a voice whispered in the back of my mind, pushing me to succumb to my worst desires. I tried to ignore it and reason it away. Stress, I told myself, too much time spent on the road. But I sensed there was something wrong. Something was shifting inside me, something dark and terrible. And then, one night, it occurred. I was transporting a shipment of electronics from Atlanta to Memphis via Mississippi's winding roads. It was a moonless night, with just my headlights and the odd flickering neon sign of a wayside cafe providing illumination. I was exhausted and on edge, and the whispering in my head became louder and more forceful. I stopped over at a rest stop, intending to get a few hours of sleep. As I laid down in the sleeper cab, the tattoo on my arm started to burn. It felt like someone was holding a hot iron to my flesh, and the agony was so acute that it brought tears to my eyes. When I gazed down at the tattoo, my blood raced cold. The snake was moving. Its scales shimmered and moved, its eyes shone with an eerie red light, and its razor-sharp teeth seemed to elongate and drip with a viscous black substance. And then the snake spoke. At last, it snarled, its voice a scratchy murmur emanating from deep inside my head. "We are one." Panic rushed through me, cold and stinging. I tried screaming, but nothing came out. I attempted to take the tattoo off my arm, but my fingers seemed to slide straight through it. The snake chuckled, making a deep, guttural sound that rang throughout my bones. "You cannot escape me," it whispered. "You and I are connected together, and now we'll have our retribution." The rest of the night was a blur. I recall violent flashes, my engine roaring, and someone screaming in terror. But it wasn't me. Not really. The snake was in control of my body, behaviors, and thoughts. The following morning, I awoke in a ditch with my trailer overturned and the goods spread over the roadway. My body hurt, my clothing ripped, and my hands were covered in blood. I crawled out of the debris, my thoughts whirling from the previous night's terror and guilt. What did I do? What had the snake caused me to do? I realized I couldn't remain and face the ramifications of what had occurred. So I ran. I abandoned my rig, my goods, and my life, and vanished into the vastness of the open road. I've been on the run ever since, plagued by the memory of that night and the knowledge that the snake is still with me, coiled around my soul, waiting for the next chance to seize control. I've done everything to get rid of the tattoo and break the tie between us. New Orleans has doctors, priests, and even a voodoo priestess. But nothing works. The snake has become a part of me and refuses to let go. I'm not sure how much longer I can resist it. How much longer can I maintain my sanity and humanity? But I know one thing: the ink grabs grip and never lets go. Story 9. I have always been a rule follower. Pick up and deliver the cargo with no questions asked. But all changed with the Blackwood delivery. I believed it was a normal pickup. A little wooden package, barely larger than a bread box, was waiting for me at a station in Salem, Massachusetts. The papers said that they were antiques, delicate, and should be handled with care. Destination: New Orleans, Louisiana. Simple enough. I put the container onto my truck, placed it next to a cargo of antique furniture, and hit the journey. It was a lengthy journey, but I had plenty of time. Plus, I always liked driving along the East Coast, seeing the changing landscape and the history that seeped out of every truck stop and restaurant. But this container, it began to get to me. It was impossible for me to pinpoint. It was only a sense, a prickling in the back of my neck if I approached too near. The visions were weird and realistic, with cobblestone walkways, gaslight lights, whispering voices, salt water, and decay. One night, I awoke in a feverish sweat, my dreams sticking to me like cobwebs. I couldn't get over the sensation that something was wrong. I got out of my sleeper cab and returned to check on the box, attracted to it like a moth to a flame. The depot had been dark and lonely when I picked up the container, but now, with the intense glare of the loading dock lights, I could read the lettering on it more clearly. It was addressed in fading ink to Mr. Elias Blackwood. 13, Rue Royale, New Orleans, Louisiana. There is nothing exceptional about this, except Rue Royale was a well-known location in New Orleans. A stately old home, rumored to be haunted, has been converted into a museum. I visited a few years ago and was enthralled by the legends of the prior owner, a rich trader called Elias Blackwood. But Elias Blackwood died in the 1800s. Centuries ago, a chilly fear came over me. What was I transporting inside that crate? And who was it truly intended for? I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was all a coincidence, but the sense of uneasiness became greater with each passing mile. The voices became louder and more forceful as the dreams developed. The fragrance of seawater and rot emanated from the container, soaking through the wooden slats. By the time I got to New Orleans, I was a disaster. I'm exhausted, worried, and can hardly function. I knew I should simply deliver the package and be done with it, but I couldn't escape the fear that something bad might happen if I did. I parked my truck a few streets from 13 Rue Royale and sat there for a long time, my head racing and my stomach churning. The container seemed to pulse with a faint, spooky glow in the trailer's darkness. Finally, I couldn't bear it any longer and got my crowbar, returning to open the package. I needed to know what was within. As I pulled open the lid, the wood cracked and moaned, unleashing a wash of the same cloying aroma, which was now stronger and nearly overwhelming. A heart was found snuggled among yellowed packaging materials, a wonderfully preserved human heart with elaborate engravings that seemed to wriggle and move before my eyes. I staggered back, my stomach churning, and dropped the crowbar with a crash. The heart beat briefly before being silent. I slammed the container shut and bolted. I went as quickly as I could, leaving the container, the heart, and the mystery of Elias Blackwood behind. I never delivered the container. I abandoned my rig on the outskirts of New Orleans and have never looked back. I'm not sure what happened to the container, the heart, or Mr. Blackwood's final delivery, and part of me does not want to know. But occasionally, late at night, I can still smell the sea and rot, a terrible reminder that certain things should be buried and lost to time. Story 10. I've always maintained that if you want to hear a tale, locate an elderly truck driver. We've seen everything from coast to coast and then some. However, this narrative differs. It's the kind of narrative that causes you to reconsider everything you thought you understood about the world. It all began in the Crossroads Diner, located just outside Winslow, Arizona. The crossroads had become a landmark, a greasy spoon shelter for us road warriors, noted for its unlimited coffee and world-famous apple pie. I'd been stopping there for years without giving it any attention. It was simply another pit break on the interminable highway. Then, overnight, everything changed. It was late, perhaps 2 a.m., and the restaurant was almost vacant. Just myself, a few of other truckers hunkered over their coffee, and Maggie, the proprietor, a lady who seemed to have lived 1,000 lifetimes and had the tales to prove it. I was finishing off my pie, relishing every last taste of that sweet cinnamon heaven, when I heard a crash in the rear. It sounded like a shelf toppling, followed by a series of obscenities from Earl, Maggie's husband, and the diner chef. "Everything all right back there, Earl?" Maggie cried out, her voice rough yet full of anxiety. "Just a damn mess, Mags," Earl muttered back. "Be there in a minute." Earl appeared from the rear a few minutes later, wiping his hands on his apron and looking pale and wan. He approached Maggie, muttered something in her ear, and then departed via a door behind the counter that I'd never seen open before. Now, I've always been an inquisitive person, and something about Earl's expression, the intensity in Maggie's speech, piqued my spidey senses. So, while the other drivers were not looking, I stood up and nonchalantly walked up to the door. It was unlocked. I paused for a bit before pushing it open a little and peering inside. The space behind the bar was tiny and crowded, crammed with crates of supplies and replacement parts for the diner's antiquated equipment. But it wasn't what drew my attention. No, it was the floor. Or rather, what lay under the floor, in the middle of the chamber. There was a trapdoor with ancient and aged wooden boards and a faint illumination coming from the darkness below. I could hear voices, quiet and agitated, coming from under the trapdoor. I know I should have stayed out of trouble, but my curiosity got the best of me. I took a deep breath, pulled the trapdoor open, and down a rickety flight of wooden steps into the darkness. The air down there was chilly and moist, with a slight whiff of ozone and something else, something metallic and almost pleasant. The steps went down into a vast cavernous area, dimly lighted by flickering candles positioned at random intervals around the walls. And that's when I noticed it. A city. An whole metropolis is developed under the Arizona desert. Buildings, streets, and even automobiles were bathed in the eerie glow of an unknown light source. People, clothed in clothing I'd never seen before, went about their business, their expressions a combination of interest and anxiety as they looked at me, the outsider among them. I remained there for a long time, my mouth open, my mind straining to comprehend what my eyes were witnessing. It seemed like something out of a science fiction film, a secret universe just under our feet. Maggie stood at my side, her expression stern. "You weren't supposed to see this," she murmured quietly and dangerously. I fumbled, attempting to construct words, but she interrupted me. "It doesn't matter now," she said, her voice softening slightly. "You are here. You've seen what we were concealing. ND now. You have a choice." She guided me across the city, describing its history and purpose. She described it as a shelter, a place where individuals who did not fit in or were different could live in peace, away from the outside world. She led me to see the city's leaders, a group of men and women who looked at me with both hope and terror. They informed me about the risks they faced, threats from the outside world, and the continual worry of being discovered. And then they requested for my assistance. I spent the following 3 days in that city under the Crossroads Diner, learning their habits and comprehending their anxieties. I observed their technology, culture, and manner of life. And I realized they weren't all that different from us, the folks above. They simply wanted to live in peace and be left alone. When it was time for me to depart and return to the world above, I made them a promise, a pledge to keep their secret safe from those who would exploit or destroy them. I kept my word. I never informed anybody about the city under the Crossroads Diner, but every time I traveled through Winslow, I'd stop at the diner, get a piece of Maggie's apple pie, and exchange a knowing look with her, a tacit acknowledgement of the secret we shared, the world under our feet. Story 11. They claim the desert hides its secrets and whispers them to those who listen. I never expected to be the one to hear them, but as I drove through Calico that night, those murmurs turned into shouts. Calico, California. Once a thriving silver town, now a ghost town preserved by the desert heat. I'd driven by it 100 times, its skeleton structures glaring against the hillside. Tourists visited during the day, while truckers avoided the area at night. But that night, I had a delivery. A late supply of goods for the gift store resulted in a diversion from my regular route. As I drove into town, the setting light painted the buildings blood orange and bruised purple, and the air was quieter than normal. The gift store proprietor, a wiry old man with eyes that had too much desert in them, greeted me with a frightened expression. "You shouldn't be here after dark," he said, his voice barely audible. "This place, it ain't right." I shook it off, unloaded the boxes, got his signature, and got back into my truck. However, when I turned the key, the engine coughed and sputtered, dying with a moan that resonated through the deserted streets. Damn, I thought, not tonight. I tried the ignition again, but nothing happened. Only the click of the ignition and the heavy quiet of the desert closing in. I suspected it was the battery, perhaps the alternator. I took my flashlight and toolbox, the metal chilly against my hand, and got out of the truck. The air became cooler, and a breeze whistled through the buildings, conveying the tiniest trace of voices. I opened the hood and began examining connections, the wind blowing my hair over my face. The voices became louder, from whispers to murmurs, then to furious screams and the clang of spurs on wood. I shined my flashlight around, but nothing was there. Only the deserted street, the shadows growing as the final sliver of light fell below the horizon. Then I saw them. Figures emerge from the shadows and take form in the fading light. Men and women clothed in the rough clothes of miners and townspeople, with emaciated features and eyes glowing with a cold, ghostly light. And they were furious. One of them, a tall, bearded guy with a severe scar across his face, moved forward, his palm resting on the buttstock of a revolver that shimmered like hot smoke. "You're trespassing," he hissed, his voice hoarse and emanating from all about me. "This town, it belongs to the dead." I attempted to speak, to explain that I was just passing through, but my voice got stopped in my throat. The creatures drew closer, their features distorted in wrath, their eyes searing into me. I could feel their rage, anguish, and desire for vengeance emanating off them like fire from a furnace. They were Calico's ghosts, I concluded, the spirits of individuals who had lived and died in this town, their souls attached to their last resting place. And they weren't pleased with my presence. The bearded guy pulled out his handgun, the metal glittering even in the dimming light. "This town ain't big enough for the living and the dead," the man said. "And tonight, you sleep with the ghosts." He cocked the hammer, and the sound resonated across the deserted streets like a death knell. I braced myself, knowing there was nowhere to escape or hide. But just as the bearded guy was ready to squeeze the gun, a gentle but distinct voice came from behind me. "Leave him be, Jebediah." I turned to find the gift store owner standing there, his face lit by the light from my flashlight. He carried a light in one hand, its flame flickering in the breeze and throwing dancing shadows on the nearby houses. The ghosts paused, their fury temporarily forgotten. The bearded guy, Jebediah, lowered his rifle slightly and narrowed his gaze. "This ain't your concern, old man," he yelled. "Go back to your trinkets and leave us to our business." The elderly guy shook his head, his stare steady. "This town is as much his as it is ours," he stated with a forceful voice. "He's just passing through like all of us." He walked forward, putting himself between me and the spirits. "Go on, Jebediah," he murmured, his tone quiet but steady. "Let him be." The ghosts swayed, their shapes flashing in the breeze. Jebediah looked at me, his eyes filled with rage, and then disappeared with a growl, disappearing into the darkness with the rest of the phantom horde. The elderly guy turned to me, his face etched with tiredness. "You better be on your way," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "And never come back here after dark. Some wounds do not heal, even after death." He turned and returned to his business, his light casting a lonely glimmer in the growing darkness. I did not need to be warned again. I rushed into my truck, the engine suddenly screaming to life, and drove out of Calico, the voices of the dead resonating in my ears long after the town had vanished from sight. Story 12. It was a scorching August night in Texas, the type when the air seemed thick and heavy, like breathing through a damp cloth. I was driving a shipment of electronics down to San Antonio, but I was running behind time due to a flat tire around Amarillo. I continued on, hoping a strong cup of coffee at the next truck stop would keep me going. I spotted him just after midnight, somewhere outside of Fredericksburg. A young man, perhaps no older than 20, stood by the side of the road with a bag and a thumb sticking out. Now I know not to pick up hitchhikers, particularly this late at night. Company policy, my wife's continuous cautions, and common sense all urged me to continue driving. But something about the kid's weary eyes and the way he shook in the heat, even though it was 100 degrees outside, spoke to me. "Get in," I said quietly, opening the passenger door. He rushed in, saying a heartfelt thank you as he threw his bag on the floor. He was merely a thin youngster, dressed in a faded band t-shirt and tattered knee denim. He seemed innocuous, but something about his stillness made me nervous. He just gazed straight ahead, his eyes mirroring the crimson light of the dashboard. "Heading south?" I inquired, attempting to break the ice. He only nodded without meeting my gaze. "Where you headed to this time of night?" I tried again. He eventually turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw his eyes were red, as if he had been sobbing. "San Antone," he said, his voice scarcely audible. We traveled in quiet for a time, with just the hum of the motor and the odd crackling from the CB radio. I tried making small chat, asking about his family, what he did, anything to break the stillness. He offered me one-word responses, his focus never leaving the road ahead. Then everything went odd. I was midway through a tale about a strange encounter with a grizzly in Montana when I looked across at him. He was gone, vanished. I glanced around the cab, inspecting the passenger seat, the floor, and the space behind the seats. Nothing. The youngster, his bag, and all of his stuff were gone. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart beating against my chest. I checked the door, thinking I had dreamt everything, but the door was still locked, just as I had left it. I sat there for quite a while, the stillness overwhelming. The hair on the back of my neck sprang up, and a cold sweat prickled my skin. I could not describe it. There were no reasonable explanations. I ultimately persuaded myself that it was a hallucination caused by exhaustion and too much coffee. But even years later, I can't escape the sensation that something went wrong that night. Every time I see a hitchhiker, I recall the youngster in the faded t-shirt and how he just went. Story 13. The interminable cornfields of Iowa spread out on each side of the highway, creating a monotonous green blur in the brightness of my headlights. I assumed it was just another night. The air was heavy with humidity, and the only sounds were the drone of my motor and the odd trill of crickets in the fields. I was driving a shipment of soybeans down to Kansas City, attempting to make up time after being trapped behind a pileup earlier in the day. It must have been approximately 2 a.m. when I first spotted her. A little person, just visible at the fringe of my headlights, stood by the side of the road. She seemed to be a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing a light garment that seemed to shine in the dark. I slowed down, my stomach twisted with uneasiness. It was a barren stretch of roadway, far from any town or rest station. What was a youngster doing out here alone at this time? As I approached, she turned her head toward me, and I swear I saw a flash of something strange in her eyes, a gleam that sent goosebumps down my spine. I paused, my foot hanging over the brake pedal. Part of me wanted to stop and make sure she was all right, but something deep inside me, a primitive impulse, urged me to keep driving. I told myself it was probably simply a reflection or a trick of the light. Perhaps she was with her family, camping out in the countryside. I tried to explain it away, but the picture of the girl in the white dress persisted in my memory, causing a persistent feeling of dread in my stomach. I drove on, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my gaze fixed on the road ahead. Then, approximately 20 miles down the road, I saw her again. The same girl, dressed in the same white dress, stands on the other side of the roadway. This time, there was no denying it. That was her. My blood became chilly. I tightened my grasp on the driving wheel, my heart thumping in my chest. This was impossible. There was no way she could have come so far in the time it took me to drive. I even checked my mirrors, afraid that someone was toying with me, but all I saw was the lonely highway stretching out behind me. I tried to dismiss the sensation of dread, but it just became worse with each mile. Every few kilometers, like clockwork, I'd see her again, standing by the side of the road, her pale dress shimmering in the dark. Each time, the sensation of dread in my belly intensified, and a cold sweat prickled my skin. By the time I got to Des Moines, I was a disaster. I drove into a truck stop, anxious for a break, anything to distract me from the horrific pictures that were running through my head. I tried to convince myself that it was merely a fiction of my mind, a hallucination caused by exhaustion and the hypnotic monotony of the journey. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there, chasing me, defying logic and reason. I resumed my journey, but the encounters did not cease. The girl in the white dress became a frightening figure, a continual reminder that something was wrong. I tried taking different routes, traveling throughout the day, and even listening to talk radio to keep my thoughts busy, but nothing helped. She was constantly there, a quiet phantom at the margins of my vision. I concluded the journey in a tense state, declaring I'd never drive that stretch of highway again. Even years later, I still can't describe what I witnessed. The image of that night, of the girl in the white dress, lingers with me, a terrifying reminder that certain things are better left unexplained. Story 14. They claim that time is a flat circle, and that everything we've done or will do is happening right now. I sneered at that concept, thinking it was simply intellectual jargon, until I became caught on the echoing mile. No map shows the echoing mile anymore. It's a portion of ancient Route 66 in the Arizona desert that was bypassed by the freeway years ago. Locals claim it is haunted, with the spirits of those who perished there still walking the tarmac. But I never believed in ghost tales. I figured it was simply the heat playing games on people's heads. I was driving a shipment of electronics from Flagstaff to Kingman, using back routes to avoid traffic. It was a hot summer day, with the sun pounding down on my rig and the air shimmering with heat haze. I had the radio set to a classic rock station, attempting to avoid the boredom of the unending highway. That's when I noticed it. The sign, echoing mile next 5 miles, was partially concealed by overgrown weeds with worn and flaking paint. I'd never seen the sign before, but something about it intrigued me. Perhaps it was the name, the promise of something unique, something off the beaten road. Perhaps it was simply the heat getting to me. Whatever the reason, I took the turnoff, my truck kicking up a cloud of dust as I left Route 66's familiar blacktop for the cracked and aged asphalt of the echoing mile. The road stretched out before of me, straight as an arrow, vanishing into the shimmering heat haze. The air became thick and oppressive, and the quiet was total, broken only by the rumbling of my motor and the odd screech of a hawk flying above. I drove for what seemed like hours, although I knew it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. The scene remained unchanged, flat, scrub-covered desert extending to the horizon in all directions. There are no other cars or indications of life, just the interminable road and stifling stillness. Then I spotted it ahead of me. A person stood in the center of the road, flailing its arms furiously. I slowed down and squinted through the heat haze. It was a young lady, her clothing ragged and dirty, her face pallid and tear-stained. She seemed afraid. I pulled over to the side of the road because my intuition told me something was wrong. The lady raced towards me, her eyes wild with fear. "Please," she said, her voice raspy and frantic. "You need to assist me. Here has been an accident." She pointed down the road, toward a curve that vanished into a clump of scraggly trees. "My husband is hurt. Please assist him." I did not hesitate. I grabbed my first aid equipment and followed the lady to the bend in the road. But as we approached the corner, my blood became cold. My truck was in the center of the road, its front end folded like an accordion, smoke rising from the wreckage. I found myself sleeping close to his shattered and mangled corpse. I stumbled back, gut churning and head whirling. It could not be. It was impossible. The lady shouted, a high-pitched, heartbreaking cry that reverberated throughout the empty terrain. And suddenly everything went dark. I awoke in my rig, the motor running, and the radio playing the same classic rock tune I had heard previously. The sun pounded down on my windshield, the air shimmered with heat haze, and the limitless asphalt of Route 66 stretched out before me. It seemed like a horrible dream, a nightmare that had faded with the early light. I shook my head, attempting to remove the cobwebs, convincing myself that it was simply the heat and my mind playing tricks on me. I went down my path, but I couldn't escape the sensation that something was wrong. The recollection of the crash, the lady, and seeing my own mangled body on the asphalt tormented me. A few miles later, I spotted it again. The sign reads, "Echoing mile. Next 5 miles." My pulse was pounding in my chest as I reached the turnoff. I knew I should continue driving, but something drove me to return to that cursed stretch of road. The cycle repeated. The lengthy drive, the suffocating stillness, the lady, the accident, and the terror of seeing my own death. I was locked in a time and horror cycle, reliving the same horrible day over and over again. I'm not sure how many times I perished on the echoing mile. How many times did I replay that horrifying moment? But slowly, I began to notice little distinctions. A different music on the radio, a unique cloud formation in the sky. The woman's eyes have a distinct expression. I knew I had an option. I could keep repeating the same terrible cycle, or I could strive to get out. The next time I saw the lady in the road, I didn't stop. I swerved my truck, nearly missed her, and continued driving. I could hear her angry and despairing yells behind me, but I did not glance back. I drove till I reached the end of the echoing mile and returned to the familiar blacktop of Route 66. And then I continued driving. I never returned to the echoing mile. I'm not sure whether I broke the loop or if I'm still experiencing a warped version of events. But that day, I learnt an important lesson. Time may be a flat circle, but we do have the ability to choose which route we pursue. Story 15. As I drove into the rest area just outside Eureka, California, the air was dense with the fragrance of pine needles and moist ground. It had been a long journey from Portland, and the customary lethargy was setting in. I was hauling a cargo of timber to a furniture company in the south, a regular trip I'd made many times before. After getting a tepid coffee and a stale sandwich from the vending machine, I decided to stretch my legs and check on the cargo. As I proceeded down the trailer's side, shining my spotlight on the piled timber inside, something grabbed my attention. Near the rear, there was a part of wall that didn't quite fit in. The wood was dark, nearly black, and the grain seemed irregular. Curiosity heightened, I went into the trailer, my boots crunching on the sawdust-covered floor. I ran my palm over the questionable portion of the wall. It felt rougher and permeable than the surrounding timber. I gave it a push, expecting it to be firm, but to my surprise, it yielded somewhat. My heart began pounding. I retrieved my crowbar from the toolbox and shoved it into the gap. With a moan of ancient wood and rusted nails, a portion of the wall slid forward, exposing a concealed room. The odor that struck me was awful. It was the distinct, gut-wrenching odor of decay, of death. My stomach churned, and I battled the want to puke. I spotted them as I shined my flashlight into the darkness. Bones, human bone. Skulls with empty sockets looked at me, their fangs bared in a wordless scream. Long leg bones protruded from a tangle of smaller bones, like a horrific jigsaw puzzle of human remains. Panic raced through me. I staggered back, releasing the crowbar with a clang that rang around the quiet trailer. My mind raced, attempting to make sense of the horrific image in front of me. Who would do anything like this? So why? I knew I needed to contact the cops, but a wave of sickness swept over me, and my legs felt like jelly. I groped for my phone, my hands trembling so much that I couldn't even call. The dispatcher's calm and professional voice broke through the shroud of anxiety that had crept over me. I told her everything, my voice quivering as I explained the concealed compartment's awful contents. Within minutes, the cops came, sirens blaring and flashing lights painting the night sky red and blue. They crowded the trailer, their expressions dismal as they examined the situation. My gut churned as I watched them meticulously remove the remains from the trailer, treating it like a horrific crime scene. I spent the next several hours answering inquiries and detailing every aspect of my horrifying discovery. The cops were tight-lipped, but their looks indicated that this was no ordinary crime. I never discovered out who the bones belonged to or why they were placed in my trailer. The encounter made an unforgettable impression on me, a terrifying reminder that even in the most mundane of vocations, evil may lurk in the most unexpected places. Story 16. The Pennsylvania night was alive with the sound of cicadas when I drove into a deserted rest area off Route 81. The air was heavy with humidity, and a fine mist clung to the ground, distorting the boundaries of the poorly illuminated parking lot. I was driving a consignment of frozen products down to Charleston, and the monotony of the roadway had put me into a near trance. I parked my truck at the far end of the lot, away from the few other vehicles strewn about, and settled down for a few hours of sleep. I was just falling asleep, the hum of the refrigerator unit a familiar lullaby, when I heard it. A small scraping sound may be heard from the rear of the trailer. I sat up with my heart beating. I realized I should not have stopped here. This rest station had a reputation. Truckers whispered tales of mysterious events and objects that went bump in the night. I disregarded them as ghost tales, the musings of lonely truckers with vivid imaginations. Now I was not so sure. The scratching again, this time louder, followed by a deep, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my maglite off the dashboard and walked out of the truck, feeling my breath catch in my throat as chilly night air touched my face. I moved gently to the rear of the trailer, my flashlight beam piercing through the darkness. The scratching became more intense, interrupted by the odd thud, like if something heavy was moving within. I tightened my grasp on the maglite, and my knuckles became white. I took a big breath and flung open the trailer doors. My spotlight illuminated the neatly placed cartons of frozen food, but revealed nothing. I surveyed the trailer, my pulse still beating, but there was no indication of an intruder. I closed the doors and locked the latch, feeling relieved yet uncomfortable. When I turned to go, I heard it again. A faint murmur could be heard within the trailer. It sounded like a voice, hoarse and feeble but clearly human. Help ... US ... Terror grabbed me. I scrambled for the keys, my hands trembling so much that I could barely get the lock open. I flung the doors wide again, desperately scouring the darkness with my flashlight beam, and that's when I saw them. 3 individuals were huddled in the far corner, their eyes gleaming in the dark. They weren't quite human. Their skin was light, almost transparent, and stretched tight over lengthy limbs and distorted features. Their enormous dark eyes gazed at me with a desire that chilled me to the core. One of the figures, the tallest of the 3, approached me, its long skeletal fingers stretching out. Its mouth extended in a wordless growl, showing rows of sharp, needle-shaped fangs. I slammed the door shut and fled. I kept running until I reached the brilliantly illuminated gas station across the highway, the fearful cries of those monsters reverberating in my ears. I never stopped at that rest area again. And to this day, I can hear those murmurs in the dark, a haunting reminder of the night I encountered something genuinely awful. Story 17. The rain was pouring down in torrents, a relentless torrent that smashed against my windshield and transformed the roadway into a dangerous river of black ice. I was on my typical route from Chicago to St. Louis, transporting car parts, but the storm had slowed me to a crawl. My eyes felt heavy, and the hypnotic swish of the wipers did nothing to relieve the lethargy. I needed strong coffee and a place to rest my tired bones for a few hours. Then, through the hazy windshield, I saw it. A neon sign, its hues flowing into the rain-soaked night, called to me like a beacon in the storm. Crossroads Diner, it said in big, welcoming lettering. Open 24 hours. I exited the highway, my tires crunching on the gravel shoulder, and entered the diner's practically empty parking lot. The only other vehicle was a battered pickup truck, its paint barely visible under a thick coating of muck. I pulled open the restaurant door, a joyful bell clanging over my head, to be welcomed by a rush of warmth and the delicious smells of coffee and sizzling bacon, a pleasant contrast to the chilly, rainy night outdoors. The restaurant was tiny and comfortable, with a long counter on one side and booths along the other wall. A jukebox in the corner played a sorrowful country tune, its melody mixing with the repetitive clatter of rain on the windows. A few customers filled the booths and counter stools, their faces buried in shade and their words scarcely audible above the storm. A single waitress, her face etched with exhaustion, was behind the counter, cleaning it down with a cloth. "Come on in, Honorable," she said, her voice unexpectedly warm and welcoming. "Take a load off. Coffee is fresh." I grabbed a seat at the counter, relieved to have escaped the storm's intensity. The waitress handed me a warm cup of coffee, its scent filling my nose and erasing the last remnants of slumber. "Rough night out there," I said, looking towards the window. "Worst I've seen in years," she said with a low drawl. "The roads are practically flooded out there. You're fortunate to have made it here." I took a drink of coffee, and the harshness jolted me awake. "Yeah, I guess I am," I said, my gaze roaming the restaurant. There was something strange about the location. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the atmosphere seemed thick, even suffocating. The other customers, I realized, were unusually still, They sat slumped over their food, their faces hidden under caps or their own shadows. No one talked, laughed, or even appeared to notice my presence. I attempted to dismiss the sensation of discomfort, blaming it on exhaustion and the disturbing weather. But as I began to examine the diner's patrons, a terrible thought dawned over me. Their clothing. Everyone seemed to be dressed in ancient clothing, like something from an antique snapshot. Faded gowns, old overalls, and outfits that seemed to belong in a museum. Their features, seen behind their caps or in the flickering gaslight, were strange, pale, almost transparent, with eyes that seemed to mirror the violent storm outside. My heart began pounding in my chest. The eatery guests and eerie quiet seemed odd. It reminded me of a nightmare. I looked at the waitress, who was gazing at me with narrowed eyes and a knowing smirk on her lips. Her complexion was pale and immaculate, and her eyes radiated an unusual radiance. That was when I knew. I wasn't in a diner. I was at a way station, where the living and the dead intersected. I lurched back from the counter, knocking over my coffee cup and pouring its contents on the floor like a pool of blood. The other customers turned towards me, their features lit by the flickering gaslight and their eyes blazing with the cold, ravenous light. I could not wait to see what occurred next. I pushed open the restaurant door and bolted, the rain a welcome respite from the horrors I had seen inside. I never glanced back, but I could feel their cold, lifeless eyes on me as I rushed away into the storm. The Crossroads Diner will be imprinted on my memory as a disturbing warning that certain doors should never be opened. Story 18. The GPS panel flickered, its happy computerized voice in stark contrast to the rising uneasiness in my belly. Rerouting. N. 500 feet, turn left. I was transporting medical supplies from Boston to Baltimore, a trip I was well familiar with. I thought I did. This was a novel diversion. It had begun innocently enough, with the GPS suggesting a faster route, leading me away from the familiar I-95 and onto a succession of increasingly small state roads. Now, surrounded by deep, unknown woods, I was beginning to regret trusting the darn machine. The advertised left turn turned out to be a barely there dirt track, just wide enough for my truck. Trees crowded in on each side, their limbs thick with a sickly-looking moss that shone dimly in the dusk. I paused, my fingers hanging over the shifter. Something felt strange, but the GPS persisted on this route, and my delivery deadline was approaching. Cursing under my breath, I eased the truck into the dirt track, the huge tires crunching against the uneven terrain. The forest absorbed the engine's sound, leaving me in an eerie calm punctuated only by the chattering of invisible insects and the odd rustling of leaves. The GPS continued to drive me farther into the woods, the predicted arrival time rising with each mile. The woodland got deeper, and the air was heavy with the odor of moist dirt and decomposing leaves. I hadn't seen another car for what seemed like hours. Then, through a gap in the woods, I saw it. A building. A large, expansive brick and steel building, with gloomy, lifeless windows. A rusting sign, barely adhering to the disintegrating exterior, read, "Cranston Manufacturing Plant." The GPS chimed, sounding almost jubilant. "You have arrived at your destination." My blood became chilly. This abandoned factory was certainly not my chosen goal. I double-checked the GPS settings as well as the address on my delivery document. Everything seemed to be in order. Yet here I was, trapped in the middle of nowhere, gazing at a dilapidated plant that seemed to have been abandoned for decades. A shudder went down my spine. The factory was completely silent, with only the wind whispering through the trees to break it. It felt wrong, as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something. I attempted to ignore my rising anxiety and justify the situation. Maybe the GPS coordinates for the medical supply warehouse were incorrect. directing me to this abandoned facility. Perhaps someone inside might lead me in the correct route. As I exited the taxi, the air was chilly and wet, with a slight odor of chemicals and something metallic, like to old blood. I cried out, my voice booming across the still woods. "Hello, is anyone there?" I received just silence as a response. I approached the facility with caution, my fingers hanging near the tire, iron hidden beneath my seat. The closer I got, the more uncomfortable I felt. I noted that the windows were not just gloomy, but also boarded up from the inside, with the wood rotting and warping with age. The walls were covered with fading and peeling graffiti, with odd patterns and unsettling imagery that sent chills down my spine. I came to a halt before the main entrance, which was a large steel door, locked with a thick padlock. Through a breach in the wood, I caught a glimpse of the manufacturing floor, cluttered with garbage and shrouded in darkness. And then I heard it. A sound came from within the facility, a loud guttural growl, followed by a scraping sound that resembled something heavy being dragged over the concrete floor. Panic overcame me. This wasn't your typical abandoned factory. Something was within, and it didn't want to be discovered. I did not hesitate. I turned and dashed back to my pickup, my heart thumping in my chest. As I struggled with the keys, I could hear the noises from within the factory becoming louder and angrier. The engine came to life, and I pushed the vehicle into drive, not daring to glance behind. The dirt route seemed much more dangerous in the dark, but I drove the truck to its limits, anxious to escape the horror I had walked into. I've never discovered what lurked within the Cranston manufacturing plant, and I never want to. That night, my GPS misled me not just physically, but also into a world of horror and darkness I had never idea existed. Story 19. As I drove into the Flying J truck stop just outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, the air was thick with the stench of fuel and despair. It was almost 3 a.m., the witching hour, and the only other people up were a couple of tired truckers crouched over mugs of coffee and a cashier who looked like she hadn't blinked in a week. I was 3 days into a cross-country trip, my sleep routine a distant memory, and the boredom of the road was beginning to get to me. The quiet in the cab was stifling, interrupted only by the engine's hum and the odd crackling from the CB radio. I used to like listening to the CB conversation, the companionship of the open road, and the shared experiences and cautions that made you feel like you were a part of something larger than yourself. But recently, there has been nothing but static and stillness, ever after the accident. My friend, Mark, had been traveling the same trip a year previously when his truck jackknifed on an icy stretch of roads south of Denver. They never discovered his corpse, only the wreckage of his vehicle, twisted and crushed beyond recognition. I recall the last chat we had over the CB, his voice crackling over the speaker, full of energy and laughing. We were discussing our families, our aspirations, and the normal trucker BS. He was telling me about his daughter's forthcoming birthday and how eager he was to go home and pamper her rotten. Then there's static. A sudden explosion of white noise drowned out his speech. I screamed out to him, my pulse thumping in my chest, but there was no response, just a constant hiss of static. Later that night, I learned from another trucker who observed the collision that the static occurred at the same time Mark's vehicle went off the road. I attempted to get rid of the memories, the guilt, and the lingering sense that I could have done something, anything to stop it. But it hung to me like a shadow, a continual reminder of the precariousness of life on the road. I had finished filling my thermos with coffee and was ready to return to my vehicle when I heard it. A faint voice could barely be heard over the hum of the freezers and the distant rumbling of highway traffic. It came from the CB radio, which was hung on the wall near the cash register. I paused, my heart missing a beat. The voice sounded familiar, strangely familiar. Are there any breakers out there? Come back, Sparky. Sparky, that was Mark's handle. His daughter gave it to him, saying he reminded her of a cartoon dog she adored. I moved closer to the radio, my breath caught in my throat. The voice was faint and garbled, but it was easily identifiable. It was Mark. "Sparky, is that you?" I muttered, my voice shaking. The static became louder, a high-pitched screech that sent chills down my spine. Then Mark's voice, now clearer, filled the truck stop. "Tom? Is that you, buddy?" I lurched backward, my heart beating in my chest. "Mark, how and where are you?" "Don't know, Tom," he said with a weird eagerness. "It's chilly and dark, and get out." "Get out of where?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The static resumed, drowning out his response. I strained to hear, my palm hovering over the broadcast button, but the only sound was a constant hiss of white noise. The voice disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. The CB radio went quiet, and the only sound was the buzz of the truck stop's fluorescent lights. I stood there for a long time, my pulse hammering and my thoughts running. Had I really heard Mark's voice? Or was it simply my mind playing tricks on me after a long day of driving and sleeping little? I never heard from Mark again, but that night, at that lonely truck stop, I believe I heard my deceased buddy beckoning to me from beyond the grave. Story 20. The Wyoming wind howled like a banshee, whirling the snow into a blinding whiteout that made it seem as if the world was dying. I was driving a cargo of construction materials to Casper, but the snow had arrived earlier than predicted, turning the route into a dangerous ice rink. Even with chains on my tires, I was barely plodding along, the wind buffeting the rig like a toy truck. Visibility was reduced to a few feet, and the snow was falling so heavily that it was difficult to distinguish where the road stopped and the ditch started. My CB crackled with the terrified shouts of other truck drivers, their words lost in the static and roaring wind. I was stuck, alone, with the storm approaching like a ravenous beast. Then, amid the whirling snow, I saw it. A small light flickers in the distance. In the bleakness, there is a ray of optimism. I tightened my hold on the steering wheel, my pulse beating with terror and hope, and carefully guided the rig towards the light. As I approached, the light showed a modest wooden cottage, its windows blazing brightly in the dark. Smoke curled from the chimney, a witness to the fire that undoubtedly blazed within. It was a lifeline, a safe haven from the lethal cold and the storm's unrelenting ferocity. I drew my rig up near the cabin, the engine gasping its last as I switched to neutral. The stillness, when it arrived, was nearly deafening. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, there was a feeling of quiet and protection. I took my flashlight and my thick winter coat and walked outside into the storm. The wind slammed me with such ferocity that it almost knocked me off my feet, and the snow stung my face like thousands of tiny needles. I struggled through the knee-deep snow toward the cabin, each step an effort to counteract the blizzard's unrelenting ferocity. I approached the porch, its wooden planks slippery with ice, and hammered on the massive wooden door. The wind drowned up the sound, but a second later, the door creaked open, showing a person silhouetted against the warm light from within. "Well, come on in, son," a rough voice said. "You'll catch your death out there." I walked inside, relieved to have escaped the storm's ferocity. The cabin was modest, a single room with a rough-hewn table and chairs, a wood-burning fire that provided heat, and a loft reachable by a rickety ladder. The walls were crammed with shelves filled with canned food, tools, and other supplies, indicating a life lived off the grid. The guy who answered the door was tall and broad-shouldered, his face worn and lined like a topographical map, and his eyes piercing blue, as if they could see right through me. He wore a thick flannel shirt and pants, and his hands were calloused and powerful. "My name is Jeb," he added, offering a hand. Jebediah, but everyone calls me Jeb. Tom, I said, shaking his hand, thank you for taking me in. Would have been stuck out there all night. No problem, son, Jeb answered, waving his hand dismissively. Always happy to assist a fellow traveler in need. Storm is the worst I've seen in years. You're fortunate to have discovered this spot. He pointed to the table where a pot of coffee steamed on the burner. Coffee's hot, and there's some stew left if you're hungry. I poured myself a cup of coffee, feeling its warmth flow throughout my freezing body, and took a seat at the table. Jeb joined me, his eyes examining me with a calm intensity that made me feel a little uneasy. So, where are you going in such a hurry, Tom? He said, his tone rough, but not hostile. Casper, I responded. We received a delivery of building materials. Would have arrived hours ago, but the storm. Casper, huh? Jeb laughed with a rumbling growl in his chest. That's a long way off, particularly considering the weather. You'll be lucky if you get there by tomorrow. We spoke for a little longer about the storm, life on the road, and the isolation of the open roadway. Jeb was a man of few words, but his eyes were full of knowledge and experience that demanded respect. The storm raged outside as the night progressed, but the cabin remained warm and protected. I had a feeling of calm and appreciation that I hadn't felt in a long time. Then I overheard it, a voice. The sound was faint at first, hardly discernible over the roaring wind and crackling flames. It seemed to be coming from the loft, a low, sorrowful murmur that sent chills down my spine. I looked at Jeb, who seemed unfazed, his attention fixated on the fire. Jeb, I muttered, my voice barely audible. Did you hear that? He turned to me, his gaze narrowed. Hear what, son? A voice, I hissed, coming from the loft. Laughed with a rumbling growl in his chest. It's only the wind, son. I'm pulling your leg. You are exhausted, that is all. He returned to the fire, but I couldn't escape the sensation that something was wrong. The voice, while weak, was clearer now. A woman's voice, heavy with anguish and misery. I carefully rose from the table, my pulse thumping in my chest, and moved approached the ladder leading to the loft. Tom? Jeb's voice sounded stern now, tinged with caution. What are you doing? I ignored him, my interest outweighing my dread. I ascended the ladder, each creaky step echoing through the cabin's solitude. The loft was dark, with just a faint glimmer from the fire below. I scrambled for my flashlight, fingers quivering, and turned it on. The beam of light shone through the darkness, revealing the loft's dusty interior. And that's when I saw them. Hundreds of CB radios sat neatly against the far wall, their antennae pointing at the ceiling like accusatory fingers. Next to the radios, there is a mound of clothing. Women's clothing. The voice, now closer, seemed to be emanating from the radios, a chorus of murmurs, each filled with agony and fear. I staggered back, my blood becoming cold. The voice, attire, and expression in Jeb's eyes made sense now. He wasn't some sweet elderly guy providing refuge from the storm. He was a monster, a predator who led innocent ladies to their deaths. And I was stuck within his lair, with a storm roaring outside and the spirits of his victims uttering warnings. I attempted to run, but it was too late. Jeb stood at the foot of the ladder, his face distorted in wrath, a tire iron securely held in his fist. You shouldn't have come here, son, he said, his voice a guttural sneer. Now, you're never leaving. Story 21. The night in New Mexico was wide and starry, making you feel little and inconsequential in the larger scheme of things. I was transporting electronics down to El Paso, and the radio was playing nothing but static, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the long ribbon of blacktop stretching out in front of me. I was driving through the borders of truth or consequences, a town, whose name always made me laugh when the motor stalled. It wasn't anything significant, just a little blip, but it was enough to make me uncomfortable. My truck was an old, temperamental beast that always broke down at the worst possible moment. I pulled over to the side of the road, the quiet jarring after the incessant drone of the engine. The only light came from the moon and stars, which formed long, spooky shadows over the desert scrub. I examined the gauges and lifted the hood, but there was nothing visible wrong. I settled down for the night, thinking it was only a gasoline line problem that I could solve in the morning. I took my sleeping bag from the bunk, slid into the driver's seat and tried to ignore the nagging sense that I wasn't alone. I awoke about 3 a.m. with my heart thumping in my chest. The taxi was bathed in an odd, pulsing light, a kaleidoscope of hues that seemed to be emanating from outside. I sat up, heart in my throat, and looked out the windshield. The desert, normally cloaked in darkness, was blazing with light. It seemed as if someone had pointed a massive spotlight at my vehicle, the intensity of the light almost blinding. Then I saw them. 3 things hovered quietly above the desert floor, their lights flashing hypnotically. They were definitely not aircraft. They were very large, quiet, and methodical in their motions. I gazed, fascinated and horrified, as the things moved quietly across the sky, their lights forming dancing shadows on the desert floor. They seemed to be examining me, their lights increasing as if attempting to penetrate the metal shell of my vehicle. I'm not sure how long I remained there, stuck in place, my mind straining to comprehend what my eyes were witnessing. It seemed like hours, but it may have been minutes or even seconds. The presence of such items made time seem meaningless. The things then vanished into the expanse of the night sky just as fast as they emerged. The light faded, leaving me in darkness once again, interrupted only by the sound of my own rapid breathing. I sat there for a long time, my body quivering and my thoughts full of questions and worry. Had I really seen what I believed I saw? Or was it a delusion, a trick of the desert night playing on my sleep-deprived brain? I never discovered out what the lights were or where they originated from. But one thing is certain, I'll never forget the night at Truth or Consequences when the desert sky shone with lights that defied explanation. Story 22. As I drove along a desolate stretch of Route 66, the sun was setting below the horizon, painting the Arizona sky in orange and purple. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and sagebrush, and the only sounds were the drone of my motor and the odd shriek of a hawk hovering above. I was transporting ancient furniture from Flagstaff to a collector in Oklahoma City, a journey that always made me nostalgic for a bygone period. Route 66, known as the Mother Road, is a ribbon of asphalt that once transported a nation's hopes westward. It was now primarily a ghost road, bypassed by the highway and haunted by recollections of a slower-paced existence. When I spotted her, I was deep in concentration, recalling the tales my grandpa used to tell me about his days driving the Mother Road. A lady stands by the side of the road, thumb extended in the ubiquitous hitchhiker sign. Now I know better than to pick up hitchhikers, particularly on such a lonesome stretch of roadway. But there was something about this lady that pulled me in, her head held high, her shoulders straight. My curiosity took over, and I slowed the truck. As I went closer, I saw she was stunning, with long, flowing black hair and piercing blue eyes that sparkled in the fading light. She wore a long, white gown that appeared to shimmer in the approaching darkness. I pulled over a safe distance ahead and rolled down my window. "Need a lift?" I cried out, barely heard over the engine's rumbling. The lady gave a sorrowful, forlorn look that sent shivers down my spine. "That would be lovely," she said, her voice gentle and musical, like the sound of a faraway bell. She strolled toward the vehicle, her motions beautiful and flowing, like a willow swinging in the breeze. As she approached closer, I realized her attire was old-fashioned, similar to what my grandma wore in old pictures. She approached the passenger door and paused, her fingers lingering over the handle. "Do you mind if I ask a favor?" she inquired, her voice barely audible. "Sure," I said, my curiosity piqued. "Anything." "Could you please drive me to the next town?" she said, her voice quivering slightly. I seem to have misplaced my way. "Of course," I said, opening the door. "Hop in." She slipped into the passenger seat, her clothing rustling like dried leaves. The taxi was laden with the sweet, cloying perfume of lavender, which seemed out of place in the sandy desert air. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely heard over the buzz of the motor. "You're very kind." We traveled in quiet for a time, with just the rumbling of the motor and the odd crackling from the CB radio. I attempted to make small chat by asking her name and where she was going, anything to break the awkward stillness that had come over the taxi. But she just smiled sadly and shook her head. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said softly, her voice filled with a profound, enduring sadness that sent shivers down my spine. I looked at her, my anxiety increasing with each passing mile. There was something strange about her. Her skin was light, quite transparent, and her eyes seemed to mirror the increasing darkness outside, which seemed to be seeping into the cab and freezing me to the bone. I tried to concentrate on the road, the fading light, everything but the weird lady seated next to me. However, her presence was overpowering and her silence deafening. Then I observed something weird. My headlights normally illuminated the road ahead, but this time it was black, pitch dark. And the air, which had been pleasant and dry, was suddenly frigid and moist, like a tomb. I slammed on the brakes and the truck skidded to a stop on the desolate roadway. "What the?" I started with a shaking voice, but the lady was gone, vanished. The passenger seat was vacant, with just the aroma of lavender and a chill in the air I inhaled as proof of her presence. I sat for a long time, my pulse hammering and my thoughts racing. Had I dreamed the whole thing? Was my mind playing tricks on me due to weariness and loneliness on the road? Then I saw it. A solitary white rose lay on the passenger seat where the lady had been seated. Their petals were as white as snow, and their aroma was a beautiful, haunting memory of the mystery hitchhiker in the white dress. I never saw the lady again, but I'll never forget that night on Route 66 when I saw the Mother Road's spirit, a warning that certain travels should be avoided. Story 23. The limitless plains of Kansas spread out before me, a monotonous scene of wheat fields and wind turbines that seemed to go on forever. I was transporting a shipment of grain to Oklahoma City as the sun sank, bathing the sky in brilliant orange and crimson. It was a magnificent scene, but I couldn't escape the dread that had been bothering me since the morning. It began quietly, with a thin smear on the inside of my windshield, directly in my line of sight. I attempted to remove it, but it wouldn't budge. It wasn't dirt, filth, or anything I could recognize. It seemed like someone had carved a mark on the glass itself. I rejected it as an odd optical illusion. But as the day progressed, the mark became bigger and more definite. It started to resemble a symbol, a circle with a dot in the middle, like an eye looking back at me. I tried to ignore it and concentrate on the road, the never-ending stream of trucks and automobiles that shared the highway with me. But the symbol appeared to pull my attention, and its presence became stronger with each passing mile. As twilight fell over the fields, the sign started to shine. It projected a faint, ethereal glow of pale blue that pulsed with an unsettling pattern. I pulled over on the side of the road, my heart pumping and my thoughts racing. I'd heard stories from truckers about unusual events on the road, unexplainable phenomena that defied logic and reason. But I'd always discounted them as folklore, the musings of lonely truckers with vivid imaginations. Now I was not so sure. The sign continued to flash, its light filling the cab with an eerie brightness. I could feel its energy, a chilly, tingling feeling that crept throughout my body and caused the hairs on the back of my neck to stand on edge. Then the writing emerged. It began slowly, with a single phrase appearing next to the blazing symbol. Then another, until the whole windshield was covered with a message penned in a language I couldn't comprehend. The letters shone with the same eerie blue light as the sign, their shapes twisting and twirling like flames caught in a wind. I attempted to understand them and make sense of the message, but it was like trying to read fog. The air in the cab seemed thick and oppressive, as if a large weight had descended over me. I could feel my pulse racing in my chest, and my breath came in short, weak gasps. The text faded as fast as it appeared. The sign slipped away, its brightness dimmed, leaving me in darkness once again. I sat there for a long time, my body quivering and my thoughts filled with terror and bewilderment. What had I just seen? Was it a communication from another realm, or a warning from beyond the veil? Or was it all in my imagination, a delusion caused by exhaustion and the hypnotic monotony of the journey? I resumed my trek, my eyes fixed on the road and my thoughts racing. The recollection of the blazing symbol and the mysterious message lingered in my mind, a terrifying reminder that certain things are better left unexplained. The following day, I had my windshield replaced. Even today, years later, I can see the faint shape of the symbol, a ghostly remembrance of the night the writing appeared on my windshield, a message from an unknown sender, its meaning lost in the expanse of the Kansas night. Story 24. The Utah night was a patchwork of blackness, interrupted by the odd, lonely truck stop or the distant lights of a town I couldn't bear to mention. I was driving from Salt Lake City to Denver as usual, transporting a load of construction supplies, when the radio switched to a country station that appeared to play nothing but sorrowful songs about grief and loss. It was one of those evenings when the miles seemed to go on forever, the road hypnotizing you with its infinite white lines and the rhythmic hum of the motor. I was struggling to remain awake, my eyes heavy, my thoughts flitting in and out of focus. I had just passed the turnoff for Green River, a town I known largely for its dinosaur museum and reputation as a trucker speed trap, when I saw it in my rearview mirror. A pair of headlights, shining bright in the darkness, approached me quickly. I'm accustomed to seeing headlights in my mirror. It comes with the territory. But something about these lights irritated me. The lights were too bright, too close together, and seemed to pulse. I checked my speed. I was already at my limit, but the lights became more intense with each passing second. I tightened my hold on the steering wheel as my heart began to pound in my chest. I looked in my side mirror, hoping to get a closer view of the car behind me. But the mirror reflected just blackness. The headlights seemed disconnected from the car itself. A shudder went down my spine. I'd heard rumors among truckers about phantom autos, haunting apparitions that plagued lonely stretches of roadway, their drivers eternally trapped in the twilight zone between this world and the next. I attempted to reason it away. It was most likely a lighting effect, a reflection from an approaching car, or my sleep-deprived imagination playing tricks on me. But the lights continued coming closer, more intense, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on edge. Then I overheard it, a deep, guttural grumble, like an engine pushed to its limits, yet warped and uncanny. It seems to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I braved another look in the mirror. This time, I noticed it. A flash of chrome, a sight of a grille that appeared to go on forever, and a set of headlights that glowed with an unusual intensity, like predator eyes fixed on its victim. Terror grabbed me. I pushed my foot on the accelerator, pushing my vehicle to its limits, and the engine screamed in protest. But the lights maintained pace, their snarl becoming louder and closer. I veered to the right, trying to allow the phantom car space to pass, but it followed my movements, its headlights never leaving my rearview mirror. I was stuck, entangled in a deadly game of cat and mouse with something beyond logic and reason. We raced down that deserted stretch of highway for what seemed like an eternity, the only noises being the boom of our motors and my own heartbeat. The phantom automobile disappeared as swiftly as it emerged. The lights, the growl, and the sense of fear that had held me were gone, leaving me in solitude and darkness once again. I slowed the rig, my body shaking and my thoughts racing. I pulled over to the side of the road, attempting to gather my thoughts and tell myself that I hadn't just peered into the abyss. I never saw the chrome ghost again, but the memory of that night on Route 40, when I was chased by something that shouldn't exist, always haunts me, a disturbing reminder that certain routes are better avoided, particularly at night. Story 25. The California coast unfurled before me, a spectacular sight of rocky cliffs, pounding waves, and a sky that appeared to go on forever. I was transporting a bunch of vegetables down to San Francisco, the sea air blowing over my hair as I drove down Highway 1, one of America's most gorgeous journeys. It was a wonderful day, the type that makes you forget about the long hours, the tiny taxi, and the solitude of the open road. I had the windows down, the radio was playing classic rock, and I couldn't stop smiling. Then the fog rolled in. It occurred so quickly, like if someone had turned a switch. One minute I was drenched in sunlight, and the next I was wrapped in a thick white blanket that lowered vision to a few feet. I slowed down, my pleasant mood fading like morning mist. Highway 1 is known for its fog, a perilous section of road that has claimed several lives over the years. I turned on my fog lights, and their rays barely penetrated the opaque white wall that enveloped me. The air became thick and moist, and the only sounds were the repetitive thud of the windshield wipers and the distant roar of the ocean. I was approaching a particularly twisty segment of the highway, a sequence of blind corners that usually made my hands sweat, even under ideal circumstances. I tightened my hold on the driving wheel, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, my thoughts racing. That's when I overheard it. A long, sorrowful howl echoed through the gloom. It wasn't the cry of a dog, a coyote, or any other animal I'd heard previously. It was different, deeper, more primal, and imbued with a sadness that sent chills down my spine. I jammed on the brakes, sending my truck sliding slightly on the moist pavement. The howl seemed to be coming from right in front of me, but the fog was so dense that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. I pulled down my window, the chilly, moist air striking me like a punch in the face. The howl rang out again, closer this time, and I swear I felt something brush against my arm, a chilly, brief touch that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on edge. Panic overcame me. I'd heard tales, local traditions, about a ghost dog, a haunting beast that stalked this stretch of roadway, its sorrowful cries foreshadowing tragedy. I put the rig in gear and slammed my foot on the accelerator, my heart thumping in my chest. The engine roared, but the wail continued. Reverberating all around me, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I sped into the fog, my hands white on the driving wheel, my head a mixture of terror and adrenaline. The howl became louder and closer, and it seemed as if the phantom dog was sprinting alongside my vehicle, its chilly breath on my neck. The wail disappeared as quickly as it began. The fog started to dissipate, showing the road ahead as clear and deserted. I slowed the rig, my body shivering and breathing in short, little breaths. I pulled over to the side of the road, attempting to gather my thoughts and tell myself that I hadn't just peered into the abyss. I never saw the ghost dog, but I'll never forget that day on Highway 1, when the fog crept in and the eerie howl rang through the valleys, a frightening reminder that certain routes should be avoided, particularly when the fog screams of things unseen. Story 26. The Nevada desert spread out before me, a seemingly unending expanse of sand and scrub brush roasting in the scorching heat. I was on a single haul from Las Vegas to Reno, my tanker full with aviation gasoline, and the delivery date loomed over me like a vulture. My CB crackled with the typical conversation of truckers, a soothing reminder that I wasn't wholly alone in this bleak region. I was about halfway through my shift, thinking about the dish of chicken fried steak that awaited me at the Tonopah truck stop, when I spotted something peculiar. My Peterbilt, called Betsy, was drifting. Betsy was old, approaching 30 years on the road, but she was a pretty nice vehicle. Reliable, strong, and predictable. But here she was, leaning slightly to the right and pushing on the steering wheel as if she had a mind of her own. I reversed the slide, my brow furrowing in perplexity. "Easy, girl," I said, touching my dashboard. "What's gotten into you?" However, the drifting became more forceful, dragging me farther and further away from the center line. I struggled with the steering wheel, my knuckles becoming white and my heart began to pound in my chest. "Betsy, cut it out!" I shouted, my voice booming in the empty taxi. "This isn't funny." But Betsy would not listen. The engine screamed and the truck accelerated, pushing me down the highway with a force beyond my control. I was imprisoned, a passenger in my own rig, at the mercy of a machine that had apparently gone insane. I tried every option I could think of. I pressed the brakes, but they remained unresponsive. I moved to neutral, but the engine continued to howl, and the truck maintained its fast pace. I even tried turning off the ignition, but the key would not turn. Panic washed over me, cold and piercing, as I recognized the dreadful truth. I had lost control of my own vehicle. Betsy, my trusted friend, had turned against me, her steely heart now a cage of steel and chrome. The highway stretched out before of me, a swirl of tarmac and white lines. I was racing towards an unknown destination, my destiny in the hands of a power I couldn't comprehend, much less control. The CB came to life, and the voice of a fellow trucker broke through the static. "Breaker, this is Big Red 2. Whoever is driving the Peterbilt is going for a washout. Repeat the washout. You need to turn around immediately." I gazed forward, my blood becoming cold. He was correct. A wide canyon, cut into the desert floor by previous flash floods, was directly in my path. The bridge that used to cross the washout was vanished, leaving just a pile of twisted metal and concrete behind. I was gonna die. I closed my eyes, braced for the collision, my fellow drivers' shouts reverberating in my ears. But the effect never arrived. Instead, I felt a shock, a sudden change in velocity, as Betsy veered suddenly to the left, her tires squealing in protest as she nearly skirted the cliff. I opened my eyes, my heart thumping in my chest and my body drenched in perspiration. The washout was behind me now, a yawning pit of ruin from which I had managed to escape. Betsy was slowing down now, and the engine was returning to its usual pace. I recovered control of the steering wheel, my hands trembling as I brought the truck to a halt on the side of the road. I sat there for a long time, my body shaking and my thoughts racing. What just happened? Had Betsy really saved my life? Or was it all just a terrible illusion caused by the desert heat and my sleep-deprived mind? I never learned what triggered Betsy's abrupt change of heart, but from that day on, I treated her with newfound respect, a healthy dosage of terror, and a constant reminder that even the most dependable of robots may have their own minds. Story 27. As I drove into the abandoned petrol station on the outskirts of Tucumcari, New Mexico, the air was thick with the scent of fuel and old coffee. It was almost midnight, the witching hour, and the only light came from the flickering neon sign over the pumps and the faint glimmer of the moon above. I was on a tight schedule, transporting a consignment of refrigerated products down to Phoenix, but even I knew not to push it on a night like tonight. The road was a ribbon of black ice, unseen behind a thin coating of frost, and the quiet was almost palpable. Besides, my intuition told me to quit. After years on the road, I had developed a sixth instinct that warned me when something wasn't right. The gas station was one of those forgotten outposts in the middle of nowhere, a throwback to a bygone period when Route 66 was the primary artery of the American dream. The structure seemed to have not been painted since the Eisenhower era, and the pumps creaked and moaned as if they were ready to cough up their last drop of petroleum. I drove up to the single functional pump, its line twisted in a tangle of duct tape and hope, and stepped out of the vehicle, my breath misting in the cool night air. The quiet was broken only by the hiss of the air brakes and a distant howl from a coyote out in the darkness. As I was filling the tank, my sight was drawn to the reflection in the truck stop glass. The guy was tall and thin, his face hidden by a cowboy hat pulled low over his forehead. He was standing near the men's toilet, his right hand hidden behind his back and his left hand clutching what seemed to be a bundle of cash. I attempted to obtain a better view, but the angle was incorrect. Something about the man's stance, the way he kept peeking over his shoulder, irritated me. Then another person entered the mirror. A woman's face is shrouded in the shadows of a hooded sweater, her hand extended as if reaching for the money. I stared, my stomach twisting with anxiety, as the man's hand moved at a pace that belied his nonchalant position. There was a flash of metal, a glitter of moonlight on polished steel, and then nothing. The lady collapsed to the ground, a black stain spreading on the sidewalk underneath her. The guy hovered over her for a minute, his face concealed in darkness, before turning and walking calmly towards a beat-up Ford pickup vehicle parked at the lot's edge. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It had all occurred so quickly and quietly, like a scene from a nightmare. The bloodstain on the pavement, highlighted by the flickering neon sign, served as a clear reminder that this was not a dream. I groped for my phone, my hands trembling so much that I could barely call. As the operator responded calmly and professionally, I knew I couldn't tell her what I'd witnessed. The guy was gone, and his vehicle vanished into the darkness. What about the woman? I couldn't be positive, but I was quite confident she wasn't moving. I fumbled out a narrative about a probable accident, a hit and run, anything to get the police involved. But deep down, I knew it was too late. I left that petrol station a few minutes later, the picture of the lady laying on the pavement etched in my memory. I never learned who she was or why she died that night. But I'll never forget the bloodstains on the pavement, a mute reminder of the darkness that hides on the road's outskirts, waiting for the moon to conceal its misdeeds.